Welcome to the Vandy 24/7 podcast brought to you by Butler Holdings. I'm Alaina Morris here with Brandon Bigsby. And Brandon, it's March. The big dance is getting ready to go. We've got a lot to talk about, but the Vanderbilt Commodores, the 7 seed facing the 10 seed Oregon Ducks. Just what are your initial thoughts on this matchup?
Well, I mean, first of all, how about Vanderbilt being in comfortably this season compared to a year ago, locking things in as a 7 seed? It's funny, Elena, this time a year ago, you could kind of feel the difference when watching Vanderbilt in Memorial Gymnasium. There wasn't that same anxiousness feeling that where you kind of were wondering, like, are they going to be in? Are they not going to be in? Last year, obviously, were able to make their way into the field, but we're one of the last four teams in. This time, no doubt about it. And I think they were well deserving of being a number 7 seed and a pretty interesting matchup against an Oregon team that has missed the tournament each of the last 2 years prior to this year. 19 and 11 coming into the season were actually ranked in the top 25 for a little bit earlier on in the year. Tailed off a little bit once they got in the Big Ten play, but this is a really interesting matchup. And I got to be honest, Elena, I want to get your thoughts on it as well. I think Vanderbilt has to be pretty happy with the draw, not just based on their seeding and based on the matchup, but not having to go too far from home either, playing in Durham, North Carolina, being in the Birmingham region. I think Vanderbilt overall has to be pretty happy with how selection Sunday went for them.
Yeah, I think so for sure. And I've got the bracket pulled up here, so that's what I'm looking at. But if you're just kind of looking at the overall two seeds, like you mentioned, too, you're on the right side of things. I think Duke is probably the most favorable two seed that you could potentially play against if you are a 7. And you're right, they're not having to travel across the country to Los Angeles, like where that might have been a possibility a few weeks ago. And so I think that they definitely lucked out there. I think Oregon is an intriguing matchup, and I think that this is probably one of the most favorable paths for the Commodores and where they were placed.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, you mentioned it too, just looking at who ended up on their side of the bracket. If you just look at some of the teams that they could very well end up playing if they are to get past Oregon, you've got Duke at that 2 seed. And on the other side, if they are able to upset Duke, you have North Carolina, you have West Virginia, Columbia or Washington. That's an 11 seed. They could be tricky if they were to upset West Virginia and North Carolina. But relatively comparing all of those teams that you feel like could make it into that Sweet 16 range, I don't feel like there's a large gap between Vanderbilt and a lot of those teams. And especially when you think about Vanderbilt playing the way they did in the toughest conference in the country, playing in the SEC night in, night out. We've heard Shea Ralph talk about at nauseum how competitive that conference is and how she really does feel that that's going to be something that helps Vanderbilt come NCAA tournament time. I think the Commodores have to feel really good about their draw. Now, obviously, Oregon's still a very formidable opponent, a really good team in the Big Ten, so going to have to take care of business there. But looking at big picture, I think Vanderbilt has to feel like there is the true potential for them to maybe go on a little bit of a run if they play up to their potential.
Yeah, I'm with you for sure, and that's something that Shea Ralph talked about last night after the selection show. She just feels that the potential for this team is incredibly high, and she's just excited to see what they can do in March. She feels like her team has been practicing well lately. Their last 4 games, 3 of them were wins. The one loss was to South Carolina, and you saw how that went. They made a huge push at the end of the game, and that's something Michaela Blake's talked about yesterday too, is that that game really proved to her that when her team is locked in, they can be really competitive. And Coach Ralph has said this plenty of times that she feels when her team is at her best, they can compete with anybody in the country. And I think that because of that and that potential, that they are definitely on a good part of the bracket. They don't have a lot of really tricky games to go through. Like you said, favorable matchups there. You're not getting sent to UConn or any of these other two seeds that might have been a little bit tougher. I know that would have also brought a lot of other things along with it, but I think that Duke is definitely a good spot. And of course, there's some other storylines with it too. Jordan Oliver gets to go back to her old stomping grounds and play back in Cameron Indoor one more time. And Michaela Blakes, who spent a few years watching her brother play for Duke, now gets to take her turn playing at Cameron Indoor. And so a lot of things to look forward to by the end of this week. But you always love those little extra storylines too with the personal connections.
Yeah, I mean, how awesome is that? Not just for Michaela Blake's getting to play on the same floor that she saw her big brother play for 3 years, but as you mentioned, Jordan Oliver going back to where it all started, starting out at Duke, playing in that gym, and here she is to potentially end her career playing in March Madness on that same floor. And, as you were talking about that, Alaina, I know we've talked about the bracket a little bit, but I think there's one thing that we haven't really mentioned. How big was that win against Tennessee in the SEC tournament? I feel like that potentially could have been the difference between Vanderbilt being a 7 seed and being at a really favorable part of the bracket compared to maybe being where Mississippi State was as a 9 seed on USC side of the bracket all the way out west. So it was just something I kind of noticed when looking at the bracket. Those two teams could have very easily been flip flopped, especially since Mississippi State beat Vanderbilt on the road in Memorial Gym. If Vanderbilt doesn't win that game in the SEC tournament, you maybe wonder if things maybe get flipped. So shout out to Shea Ralph and her team for the work they did over the last 2 weeks of the season to kind of help their seeding. Because I feel like if not for that last win against a team that was top 25 in the country, ended up being a number 5 seed in the tournament, Vanderbilt could have very well have been on their way to LA and having to play a unfavorable matchup in the 8-9 game and then potentially having to play against USC right after that.
Yeah, definitely. And we haven't got to really touch on that since the tournament, but I think that Tennessee win just showed what Vanderbilt is capable of doing. And they started out the game really strong. They got up by 21 at one point against a very good Tennessee team. And so that was a win I think they felt like they needed to have. Got them off that 8-9 line. And as you mentioned, you're not only going out west, but you're facing either a Lauren Betts at UCLA or a Juju Watkins at USC, which by all means is no easy task for any team. And so I think that that win was big. And one player over the last couple weeks that has really shown up and been that person that Vanderbilt has needed them to be. And if she continues to do this, Vanderbilt could be very successful. Ayanna Moore, you've got to tip your cap to her because she was terrific the last 4 games.
Yeah, and Ayanna Moore, we've heard Shea Ralph talk about how her confidence and her belief in her has never really wavered. And I think that Ayanna Moore stepping up this time of year, repaying that confidence that her head coach has had in her. I mean, I'm looking at the last 3 games right now, Elena. 18 points, 7 assists, and 4 steals against Missouri, 23 points, 4 rebounds, 2 assists against Tennessee, and then 16 points against South Carolina. I mean, she has really found her rhythm ever since the month of March. I mean, Ayanna Moore averaged just 5 points per game in the month of February. This is a player that we came in this season thinking she's going to be an all SEC selection, and rightfully so. She was an all SEC selection last year. Ayanna Moore did not just lose her talent. Sometimes you go through those rough stretches. That's going to happen. That's going to happen to any player, even some of the best scorers. But for her to find her game again, to find her rhythm and her comfort level right when Vanderbilt needed her to the most at this tail end stretch of the season has been so big for this Vanderbilt team. It takes some of that pressure off of Michaela Blake's Gabriel Pierre to drop 20 plus points every night, and it gives Vanderbilt that much needed third scorer. And if Ayanna Moore can continue playing like that into the NCAA tournament, it just kind of reinstills that belief that this is the Commodores team that maybe doesn't just go in and make the round of 64. They can maybe go in and win a game or two if you have all 3 of those pieces clicking. So Ayanna Moore finding her rhythm again the last 3 games has been really, really huge for this Vanderbilt team. And I'm interested to see if she can keep that going here over the next week.
Yeah, we've talked about her being the X factor, just kind of what Vanderbilt needs, and she's showed up in the month of March, and I guess she's ready to dance. She's feeling that little extra push in March. Of course, this time of year is when you need to be playing your best basketball, and she's feeling that right now. At least that's what it looks like from an outside perspective. And if you're the staff, if you're Shea Ralph, you've got to look and be really happy and excited with that. But obviously, that relieves some pressure off of Michaela Blake's, off of Camille Pierre, and think that I want to talk about them too. These are two players who I personally think could be very successful in March, and they're going to be very exciting to watch. I know Camille Pierre experienced it last year, but the jump she's taken from last year to this year has been so significant. And then Michaela Blake's, what she's done all year, now she gets to show that on the national level, on the big stage, being able to play in the NCAA tournament. I mean, it's going to be very fun to watch those two perform at such a high level where everyone's watching.
Yeah, and obviously, I think everyone around the country very familiar with Michaela Blakes. I mean, it's not every day you see someone go and break an NCAA record, not just once, but twice in the same season. So I think everyone's really excited to see what Michaela Blakes can do on this big stage for the first time in her career. And she talked about it. The nerves are, it's just going out there and playing. And you just kind of get the feeling that she is one of those players that isn't afraid of that moment and isn't afraid, but wants to step up in that big stage for this Vanderbilt team. And that's what she ultimately came here for. But I do want to talk about Camille Pierre a little bit as well, because she has been, like you said, someone that has been one of the consistent pieces of this Vanderbilt team all season long, has that tournament experience from last season, and is someone that I think comes into the tournament with a bit of a point to prove. I mean, was left off of the All SEC list for this year. I think there's a lot of people that felt like that was a bit of a snub. Someone that's coming in averaging just shy of a double double, 20 and a half points, 9.7 rebounds per game. She's been one of the best players in the country, undoubtedly. And we saw last year in her couple of tournament games, she played significant minutes against Columbia and Baylor at 11 points in both of those games. So she hasn't just been someone that has played in this moment, but she has succeeded in the tournament before to show that she can be productive. I'm really excited to see how she can build on that, and especially just considering how big of a leap that she has taken in her game over the season.
Yeah, you have to think there's probably a little bit of a chip on her shoulder there, especially not getting selected for all SEC honors. And she kind of showed that against Tennessee. Double double there, double double against South Carolina. I mean, South Carolina, one of the best teams in the country, and you're putting up numbers like that. I believe it was 17 points and 11 rebounds. And if you can do that, I think you're showing people that you should be you should be considered to be one of the best players in the country. And so even though she wasn't selected for those honors, she's still proving herself and showing that she's capable of doing that and she doesn't need any kind of title tied with it. And so I think that she's got that little bit of extra motivation there that, also it's kind of like you don't want to get in someone's way when they're feeling that. So I think that she's also a scary player too, but I think another thing too that we've talked about so many times, Brandon, that I want to touch on is just what Shea Ralph has done with this program. I mean, I know last year they were probably sitting on pins and needles a little bit, crossing their fingers that their name would get called at the Selection Sunday show, but last night they were sitting a little bit easier. They were just enjoying themselves watching the big screen in Memorial, and I think that just shows what she's done in her fourth season and over the last few years. She's just really built this program and is trying to get it back to where it used to be.
Yeah, and we've heard Shea Ralph talk about that she wants this program to get to the point to where, an NCAA tournament appearance, that's great. It's an accomplishment, but it's not the goal. I mean, she has talked about her vision for this Vanderbilt program being hanging banners, lifting trophies over their heads. And you're seeing Vanderbilt year by year, little by little, slowly build their way to that. You can't build a dynasty like a UConn or South Carolina overnight. It takes years to get to that point to where you are consistently contending for national titles. But Vanderbilt in year four of the Shea Ralph tenure, 221 seasons, back-to-back NCAA tournament appearances, have already won a game in the NCAA tournament, and we're continuing to see this team get a little bit better each year. I mean, like you said, Alaina, just a year ago, Vanderbilt wasn't totally sure that they were going to be in the NCAA tournament. There was that real possibility that they were going to be stuck as a top seed in the WNIT. We're going to have to be watching March Madness from home. Were able to sneak their way in, beat Columbia in that first four matchup. This time, there was no doubt about that. Vanderbilt knew they were in. They could kind of watch the selections show, sit back, relax. I know Camille Pierre was, thanking the Lord when she saw her name called, but I heard Jordan Oliver mention it. I think that was just more of a product of it being a long season and hearing your name called, just having that reward for all of the work that team and that program has put in. But again, Vanderbilt just continuing to take those steps. And I think now for the Commodores, that next step is going to be getting past the round of 64. That starts with this Oregon matchup. They've technically already gotten farther than they did last year, even, surpassing the first four matchup. Now the next question is, can they take that next step in the tournament and make it to that round of 32 by beating Oregon? But again, major kudos to Shea Ralph, that entire team, that entire staff. Jordan Oliver said it. We want to get this program back to where it used to be. This is a Vanderbilt program that is seventh all time in NCAA tournament appearances with 29. Not many people will tell you that on the national stage, but this is a program that is accustomed to being at this stage. They're not the little sisters of the poor by any stretch of the imagination. It's a Vanderbilt program that has history, has some prestige to it. It's been in the Sweet 16 multiple times. It's been to a Final Four, and they're building back to that point. And it takes some time. They're doing it step by step. but you're seeing that upward trajectory season by season.
I mean, you talked about it. 29 tournament appearances, right up there with your Notre Dames, your UConn, these elite level programs. Vanderbilt is trying to get back to that, and they're definitely on the right track. They're getting to where they want to be again, and this is just another step towards that. But like you said, we've talked about this. Think that Friday's matchup against Oregon is just where it all starts, but obviously you can't overlook that. But just kind of looking at the bracket as a whole, definitely favorable for Vanderbilt. I think that, as far as looking at each region, they probably got the best draw there. So definitely going to be interesting to see what happens in Durham, North Carolina. But if you're Vanderbilt, you have to be excited with where you're sitting at right now.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you talk about the matchup against Oregon. That's another program that we've kind of seen similarly to Vanderbilt, slowly but surely built themselves back up. When Kelly Graves first started, I believe it was back in 2014, and we've seen them kind of build that program up to where for about 4 or 5 years, Oregon was a consistent national title contender. Now, obviously, that's kind of fallen off a little bit. They missed the tournament the 2 years prior, were able to make it this year at 19 and 11, but again, this is not only a chance for Vanderbilt to make it to the round 32, but to beat a program that has been there consistently under the same regime. So it's an opportunity for Vanderbilt to go in, make that tournament run, but also beat a program that has been one of the staples of women's college basketball really over the past decade. So I think that's something too that I think is really, really interesting about this matchup. And you heard Shea Ralph talk about it last night, just the respect that she has for Kelly Graves and that program. I do think that Vanderbilt probably the better team than Oregon. I would feel rather good about Vanderbilt's chances of winning that game. Obviously, anything can happen. This is March. We've seen the less talented team, the less expected team go in and make runs before. But I think overall, Vanderbilt has to feel really good about where they ended up, not just because of the bracket, but also just the way that they've played the last 3 or 4 games. Even the loss to South Carolina. I mean, I know the Gamecocks pulled away in that game late, but Vanderbilt brought it to a 5 point game with 4 minutes left. It was genuine wonder if they could maybe pull off that comeback and win that game before the Gamecocks kind of just turned things around and took over. Vanderbilt's playing really good basketball right now. It feels like they've rediscovered themselves after kind of losing that identity a little bit during February. They've done it at the perfect time. And I think that the setup within the bracket, like you mentioned, Alaina, does set up really well for Vanderbilt to, again, not just win a game, but maybe make a little mini run in this tournament as well.
Definitely. I mean, that game against South Carolina, just especially that fourth quarter, just really showed what Vanderbilt is made of. And games before that, they won all three against Texas A&M, Missouri, and Tennessee. You have to think that if they're playing the way that they played in those games, then they could set themselves up for success. But overall, definitely exciting to see what happens in this coming week. Just obviously a long season for them, and they've got to the point, like you said, Camille Pierre dropped to her knees last night of excitement and just gratitude. The team was jumping up, celebrating. I was watching SportsCenter today, and they were talking about how, they always like looking at the reactions and that they very much considered Vanderbilt to have one of the best reactions, if not the best. So this team is definitely excited to go dancing. Full circle moment for Jordan Oliver, as she said last night, and Michaela Blake's getting to play where her brother used to play at. So a lot of exciting storylines around Vanderbilt and just a lot to look forward to this Friday against Oregon.
Yeah, and I think that's what again, it's what makes this whole thing so special because something else that Shea Ralph has talked about is that everyone on this team they bought into Vanderbilt's vision, and this is all a Shea Ralph team at this point. The only player that Shea Ralph didn't bring in herself was Ayanna Moore. Ayanna Moore was recruited by Stephanie White, but chose to stay with Shea Ralph before stepping on campus at Vanderbilt. So every single player on this team bought into what Shea Ralph and her staff were looking to do. They bought into that vision. And that's not just by simply committing. That's by showing up every day, putting in the work, doing the things that your coaches ask of you. And the Commodores are seeing the fruits of their labor now finally pay off. They saw it a bit last year by making it into the tournament, winning a game. They saw it this year by beating a pair of top 25 teams in Tennessee and Alabama, winning a game in the SEC tournament, and now earning their way to that number 7 seed. Again, I guess it kind of goes back to just that continual progression of this program, but it's just so cool to see in sports, in college basketball, especially when players stay committed to a program, buy into the vision of what a coach is doing and what is a complete rebuild. This was a Vanderbilt team that was a rebuild in every sense of the word. They had only played 8 games before Shea Ralph had gotten there due to COVID shortened season. They had won maybe 5 or 6 games the year before. Vanderbilt was a full on rebuild, a program that was a shell of its former self. And all of these players bought into that before Vanderbilt had really proven that they could get back to that point. And now they're doing it. They're being rewarded for it. And it's just so cool to see some of those little stories, like you mentioned, with Jordan Oliver going back to Duke, with Michaela Blakes playing on the same floor that her brother played on for 3 years. Little stories like that being a part of that reward for all of the work that that program has put in over the years.
Most definitely. Back to back 20-win seasons for Shea Ralph after rebuilding. Just a lot of success coming to light there for her and her staff. And definitely going to be an exciting time of year and to see what this Commodores team can do in the big dance. And I think that'll be all for Brandon and myself. We'll be able to have coverage for you. Definitely expect some stories written this weekend surrounding Vanderbilt basketball. Great time in Nashville for both Commodore basketball teams. But Brandon, I appreciate you joining me this afternoon to talk about some Vanderbilt basketball and everything that's around it right now. For Brandon and myself, appreciate you guys listening to the Vandy 24/7 podcast.